Hey there. Today I would like to talk about one of the most pernicious and widespread myths about the Obama administration's conduct of the war in Iraq. Those who want the United States to remain in Syria rely heavily on this myth. It is also central to the foreign policy ideas of both parties and the ideology and future plans of the entire U.S. foreign policy establishment. It also happens to be like 95 to 99% bullshit. Today we will show that no, it was not Obama's withdrawal from Iraq that led to the creation of the Islamic State. Now I say 95 to 99% bullshit because I guess it is conceivable that if U.S. soldiers were still in Iraq, they could have maybe stopped ISIS in 2014, but I don't think it's all that likely. I suspect that the end of the first Iraq insurgency in 2008 and 2009 had a lot more to do with the fall of oil prices after the financial crisis than it did with Bush's troop surge. If Obama had defied the Iraqi government to keep U.S. troops in Iraq after 2011, I actually think it's just as likely that ISIS would have gotten famous sooner as the leaders of a new lethal insurgency against U.S. troops in Iraq. This may seem like idle speculation, but that is kind of my point. Nobody can know what the result of a longer U.S. occupation would have been. Just assuming that a never-ending U.S. occupation of Iraq would have gone well strikes me as a lot sillier than assuming it would have been a disaster. How's the never-ending U.S. occupation of Afghanistan going? How did the Iraq occupation go before Bush committed to a timeline for withdrawal in 2008? This fantasy that a never-ending U.S. presence in Iraq would have just been great isn't really based on anything in experience or common sense. Yet everybody in Washington, D.C. seems to believe it. At this point, you may be thinking, gosh, I miss Obama, and it sure is nice to hear Rob trying to defend him. Well, I hate to disappoint you, but this is not that video. In fact, I do believe that Obama bears the majority of the responsibility for the rise of the Islamic State in 2014. But vitally, it wasn't about what he didn't do in Iraq, it's about what he did do in Syria. The Obama administration's creation of the Islamic State is not about the withdrawal from Iraq. It's about the very involved, very expensive, and very, very destructive attempt to overthrow Assad in Syria, undertaken between 2011 and 2017. Now, I've explained this a number of times now in a couple different ways, but let's give this another whirl and try to make it stick. Now, despite what the New York Times opinion page will tell you, the problem is not that Obama didn't do enough in Syria. In fact, the U.S. government did a whole hell of a lot to try to overthrow Assad. Surprisingly, it is New York Times reporters that describe the anti-Assad plot as one of the costliest covert action programs in the history of the CIA. Timber Sycamore, the name of the program, is estimated to have cost over $1 billion directly, and it coordinated untold billions more in support from Saudi Arabia and other countries. This was going on from 2012, if not earlier, and didn't end until 2017. This program was not about fighting ISIS. This was about destroying the Syrian government. And the strategy was to create large open spaces in Syrian territory for jihadists to exploit. That was the plan. Okay, let's take a look at this map of Syria. This is Raqqa, controlled by the Islamic State from 2014 to 2017. It is less than a 4-hour drive from Aleppo, Syria's second largest city. Though Assad's government managed to hold the majority of Aleppo for the entire war, it was probably the most famous battleground between 2012 and 2016. Just a little more than an hour's drive from Aleppo, you can find Idlib, the capital of what's left of our moderate rebels, which is now almost completely controlled by Al-Qaeda. What I want to emphasize here is how tiny this slice of territory is. These 3 Syrian governorates include less land area than the United States state of West Virginia. And literally billions of dollars worth of weapons were poured into this tiny region by the U.S. and our allies. Now, a tremendous amount of energy has been poured into pretending that the conflict in Syria was a lot more complicated than it actually was. Think tanks, the U.S. government, our allies, the New York Times opinion page, and seemingly everybody else in the world teamed up to hide the ball. The rebels in Syria were encouraged to set up hundreds of different groups and rebrandings over the course of the war, all in an effort to confuse the issue. Obama administration officials will tell you that they scrupulously avoided giving any money or weapons to anybody who was at all affiliated with ISIS or Al-Qaeda. They may believe that, but that's because they're high on their own supply. This idea that there were dozens of distinct siloed groups that were separate from each other has very little to do with the reality of the conflict. So we have this tiny sliver of territory where on one side you had Assad, and on the other side we supposedly had all of these distinct groups. But the groups the CIA funded and armed have always worked with Al-Qaeda. Nobody seriously disputes that. Before 2014, they worked with ISIS as well. Of course weapons went between these groups. Fighters did too. These different groups did fight each other occasionally, and ISIS did a lot of the time, but all of these distinctions have been greatly, greatly exaggerated. When you look beyond the U.S. military-industrial complex's myth-making about the nature of the divisions between these groups, it becomes very straightforward. Syria disintegrated into an almost decade-long, hellish civil war because the U.S. government paid for and organized that war. ISIS was one of the first outside groups to grasp the opportunity the U.S. government was providing. Its power was growing in Iraq thanks to the Maliki government's abuse of Sunnis, but its bloody insurgency had to be covert, stealthy, and underground. After 2012, the Obama administration's tearing down of Assad and Syria gave ISIS an open playing field. Both the Territorial Islamic State and HTS, the Al-Qaeda affiliate that now runs Idlib, were franchises set up by ISIS at the beginning of the war. As Washington, D.C.'s insane and illegal destruction of Syria ramped up, ISIS profited, taking its first big city, Raqqa, by the beginning of 2014. Did you get that? The rise of the Territorial Islamic State didn't actually have much to do with Iraq initially. And if U.S. troops had still been in Iraq, they probably would have been doing everything they could to make Syria more chaotic and open to ISIS expansion. That was U.S. policy at the time. The fact that the Territorial Islamic State started in Syria appears to be something that is quickly being dropped down the memory hole. U.S. government and media has to forget what actually happened to pretend that Obama's withdrawal from one country was more damaging than his intervention next door. It wasn't until June of 2014 that the Islamic State announced itself and came rolling into Iraq, but it was the Syrian instability that the United States had created through intervention that made the territorial caliphate possible. Without taking Raqqa first, it's hard to see how ISIS could have taken Mosul. To be clear, ISIS expansion is probably not what the Obama administration intended, but it is certainly what their policy of intervention in Syria created. The U.S. government managed, once again, to create a massive wave of terrorism. When we did it in Afghanistan in the 1980s, we were at least trying to defeat the Soviet Union. Washington, D.C. doesn't have that excuse this time. Oh, one more thing. The standard Pentagon MSNBC line seems to now be that we couldn't possibly withdraw from Syria before the Islamic State is completely defeated. Well, there's something about the timeline here that's really been bugging me. I think it's been bugging a lot of other people as well, but more respectable news outlets don't want to get into this because it makes people in the U.S. military leadership look really, really bad. Starting from Syria, the Islamic State took a series of cities. By the beginning of 2014, they had Raqqa. In April of 2014, they launched an offensive to take ez-Zor in Syria, and in June of 2014, they rolled into Mosul in Iraq. Over the course of 2015 and 2016, they were slowly pushed out of cities and countryside across Iraq and Syria, but these three cities remained as the heart of the caliphate. And then in 5 short months in 2017, they lost them all. After 9 grueling months, the Iraqi government finally took Mosul in July of 2017. The U.S.-supported Kurdish forces took Raqqa in October of 2017. In November of 2017, Assad's forces took Deir ez-Zor. So that was the situation in December 2017. After almost losing it all, Syria, Iraq, and the Syrian Kurds had come roaring back. They had built the war machines they needed and braved 3 years of brutal multi-front fighting to kick the Islamic State out of every large urban area it controlled. All that was left was a scattering of ISIS-controlled villages and desert strongholds that the U.S. warplanes could obliterate with ease. That was the situation in December 2017. And that was somehow still the situation a full year later in December 2018. Few people are willing to say this, but in my opinion, it's blindingly obvious. For the past year, elements in the U.S. government and the U.S. military leadership have actively impeded their main mission in Syria. They have no reason to be there without the Islamic State, so for the past year, they stopped fighting the Islamic State. The common excuse here is that our local allies, the Kurds, got caught up in a conflict with Turkey. The fall of Afrin should certainly have caused some delays, but a year? To clear out some villages? And once the Kurds were pushed out of Afrin in March of 2018, there should have been more Kurdish forces available for anti-Islamic State operations, not less. But the Kurds don't want the U.S. military out of Syria either. As much as I would love to pin this fraud on Donald Trump, I can't. He is just as much a target as the American public is. Donald Trump wants to get out of Syria. He has made that very clear repeatedly. But his advisors are manipulating him to keep us in and keep the war going. In more serious times, there was a word that you could use for what Trump's advisors and generals are doing. That word is treason. But we're not living in serious times. No, this whole ISIS debacle and U.S. policy in the Middle East over the past 17 years isn't serious at all. It's farce. It would be funny if it hadn't killed over 1 million people. It's public relations and media manipulation on a grand scale solely for the purpose of selling weapons. Washington, D.C. isn't betraying the American public with its policy in Syria. It's simply serving its true masters. And we in the American public keep letting them do it. To be clear, the U.S. government created the Islamic State through its policy of intervention in Syria, not because of its withdrawal from Iraq. It is absolutely perverse that the tattered remnants of the Islamic State are now being used to justify the policy of Syrian intervention that created the Islamic State. But that's Washington, D.C. conventional wisdom for you. Please don't let it keep us in Syria. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. And if you'd like to help me keep challenging Washington, D.C.'s conventional wisdom, you can click on the Patreon link here to find out more about my crowdfunding thing. I really need a new laptop. Thanks.